Hello everyone, and welcome. Our train has just departed, and you are comfortably settled in your own private compartment. You can feel the gentle, rhythmic motion as the wheels glide over the tracks, a soothing, clickety-clack, that will be our companion tonight. The tension in your body, especially in your shoulders, begins to release. You are perfectly undisturbed, ready to enjoy the trip. Allow yourself a little smile, and let's begin. Our journey tonight begins on the Orient Express. The name itself is mythical, isn't it? It evokes a world of luxury travel, of exoticism, of adventure, and perhaps even a touch of elegant danger. It is the famous setting of one of Agatha Christie's most beloved novels, a place where intrigue and glamour are fellow passengers. But what was this train, to acquire such a powerful and enduring aura? The Orient Express was a train service that first began its legendary journeys in the 19th century, connecting the vibrant, artistic heart of Paris to the mysterious, ancient city of Constantinople, or Istanbul, as we know it today. The exact route changed several times over the decades, but the initial one was a grand sweep eastward across the continent. Imagine leaving the bustling stations of France, crossing into the proud landscapes of Germany, and then into the grand old Austro-Hungarian Empire, with important stops in the magnificent cities of Vienna and Budapest. The train would continue on through Romania and Bulgaria, before finally reaching its fabled destination in the Ottoman Empire of Turkey. You must remember, this was a time long before airplanes. For a wealthy European traveler, the only other way to reach the Ottoman Empire was a long, arduous journey by sea on a steamer, a trip that could take a considerable amount of time. These new trains offered something revolutionary, a fast and exquisitely comfortable journey for those who could afford it. They offered unparalleled luxury, with comfortable private cabins, fine cuisine served on crisp linen, and a level of personal service that rivaled the finest hotels. This extraordinary new way of traveling was quickly and enthusiastically embraced by the European elite, ensuring the train's commercial success for decades to come. The first Orient Express train, launched in 1883, was a marvel of modern engineering and design. The complete train was composed of 7 cars. At each end was a car for luggage and all the supplies needed to serve the passengers on their long journey. In the middle was a magnificent restaurant coach, and connecting it all were 4 sleeping coaches, each containing between 13 and 16 beds. In total, the train could accommodate up to 60 privileged passengers. And thanks to a new innovation, covered connections between the cars, you could easily walk from your private cabin to the bustling restaurant car, even as the train was in motion. But where did this incredible idea for a rolling hotel come from? For that, we must travel back in time just a little further, and across the ocean. The inspiration for the Orient Express came from America, and from the visionary Pullman Car Company. Its founder, an engineer and industrialist from Chicago named George Pullman, had completely redefined luxury train travel in the United States. He didn't invent the sleeping car, but he turned it into a phenomenon. In 1864, he completed his first, Pullman sleeper, also known as the Palace Car, with luxurious interiors inspired by the elegant cabins of boats. In 1867, a young Belgian civil engineer from a family of bankers, whose name was George Nagelmakers, traveled to America. He was deeply impressed by the Pullman cars he saw, by their comfort, their elegance, and their brilliant business model. When he returned to Europe, he was filled with a powerful idea: he would establish a network of comparable luxury trains across the European continent. He would replicate Pullman's model, providing the elegant cars and impeccable service himself, and paying the various national railroad companies for the use of their tracks. In 1874, he founded his company, the Compagnie Internationale de Wagenslits, or the International Sleeping Car Company. And in 1883, he launched his masterpiece, the Orient Express. So as you settle back into the plush velvet of your seat, feeling the gentle sway of the carriage, know that you are part of that very dream. A dream born in America, and perfected for the grand stage of Europe. The journey has just begun. The invention of rail transport is, perhaps, far more ancient than you might imagine. In a way, its story begins in ancient Greece, around 600 BC. There, a special trackway was built to transport boats across the Isthmus of Corinth. It was a remarkable feat of engineering. The path was paved, and grooves were cut into the stone to guide wheeled vehicles that were pulled by men and animals. Similar trackways existed later in the Roman Empire, such as in Roman Egypt, serving as a strange and fascinating intermediary between a road and a true railroad. For centuries, the idea lay dormant. Then, in the 16th century, wooden railways began to appear across Europe, especially in mines. Imagine, deep underground, miners pushing heavy carts filled with or along rough-hewn wooden tracks. These early railways were a small but important part of a great shift that was beginning in Europe. For most of the Middle Ages, Europe had not been a particularly wealthy region of the world. But from the 16th century onward, that began to change. More and more innovations were being used in agriculture, in workshops, and in mining, and productivity slowly began to improve. These mining railways were one aspect of these developments, though they still used very little metal and relied on the power of horses or the miners themselves. The true technical revolution began in the middle of the 18th century, with the introduction of the first steam engines. At first, using these massive, stationary engines to power an autonomous vehicle was still unthinkable. But they had a powerful side effect. They contributed to a huge increase in iron production, mainly in Great Britain, which was the first country to begin its industrialization. As the cost of iron began to drop, the fragile wooden rails could finally be reinforced with plates of iron, which dramatically increased their durability and the load they could bear. By the end of the 18th century, the first all-iron rails were introduced, used to transport heavy loads like coal and timber over short distances. They were still powered by men and animals, but these innovations represented a huge leap in productivity. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place at the beginning of the 19th century. Steam engines were improved and made smaller, and it finally became possible to build the first locomotives. Early prototypes were not very efficient because they lacked sufficient steam pressure. That was, until a brilliant engineer named Richard Trevithick invented the high-pressure steam engine and used it to power a functioning locomotive. The year was 1802. Imagine seeing it for the first time, a noisy, hissing, steaming iron beast moving under its own power. For about 20 years, these new locomotives served only in mines and ironworks. Then, in 1825, a revolution occurred. The first ever public railroad, the Stockton and Darlington Railway, opened in Great Britain. Soon, other countries followed suit. France opened its first line in 1829, the USA in 1830, and Belgium and Germany in 1835. The world had fallen in love with the power of the train. The first truly modern railway service, with scheduled and timetabled trains for both goods and passengers, opened in 1830 between the cities of Manchester and Liverpool. At the time, Liverpool was a thriving port where raw materials like cotton arrived, and Manchester was becoming a massive manufacturing center. The promoters of the line were pleasantly surprised to find that the passenger traffic was incredibly popular and profitable. It may sound naive to us now, but in those early days, many people were genuinely afraid of trains. Never before had human beings been moved at speeds of 20, 30, or even 40 miles per hour. Some physicians worried that such speeds could be a risk to a person's health, perhaps displacing their organs or affecting their heart. Of course, these initial worries quickly faded when it became clear that nothing of the sort was happening. And with the technical and financial success of these first experiments, a railroad mania began, a fever of construction and investment that would transform the face of Europe and America forever. The period between the two great wars, the 1920s and 30s, is remembered as a time of troubles and fragile recovery in Europe. Old empires like the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian had disappeared, and ancient royal families were gone. The world was changing, wounded but vibrant. And yet, it was in this very period that the Orient Express truly prospered, acquiring its undying aura of luxury, refinement, and intrigue. Step with me now into the dining car. The heavy, ornate style of the 19th century has been swept away. In its place is a new kind of elegance, a style that is simpler, more graphic, and breathtakingly modern. This is the age of Art Deco. Imagine polished wood panels, geometric inlays, and seats upholstered in the finest velvets. And the light is soft and magical, filtered through exquisitely crafted glass panels. In the 1920s, famous artists and craftsmen were contracted to update the cars, from the table linen to the very plates you dine on. One of these was the great French glass designer, René Lalique. He created frosted, bas-relief panels of elegant figures and floral motifs that glowed from within, turning the carriage into a rolling art gallery. The train itself became a work of art, a moving masterpiece of modern design. And this masterpiece attracted the most famous and fascinating people in the world. To travel on the Orient Express in the 1920s and 30s was to be part of the most exclusive club on earth. Picture it, the actress Marlene Dietrich, a vision of mystery, might be gazing pensively out the window, a wisp of smoke curling from her cigarette holder. The dazzling Josephine Baker, perhaps with her famous pet cheetah on a leash, could be the source of delighted laughter from the bar car. The revolutionary designer Coco Chanel, impeccably dressed, might be quietly sketching new ideas in a notebook at her table. Ernest Hemingway may be holding court, telling stories of adventure and daring. Even the greatest minds of the age were passengers, scientists like Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud, and adventurers like Lawrence of Arabia. But among all these famous writers, one passenger would become inextricably linked with the train's destiny, the Queen of Crime, Agatha Christie. She traveled on the Orient Express and, like everyone else, fell under its spell. She saw the collection of colorful, wealthy passengers, each with their own secrets, all brought together in this luxurious, isolated world, and she found the perfect setting for a mystery. In 1934, she published Murder on the Orient Express. In the novel, her famous Belgian detective, Hercule Poirot, is returning to London from the Middle East. As the train hurtles through the snowy landscapes of the Balkans, it is stopped in its tracks by a heavy snowfall, trapping the passengers in the middle of nowhere. Soon, a murder is discovered among the travelers, and Poirot must investigate. The novel was a phenomenal success, not just for its brilliant plot, but because of the incredible atmosphere of the train itself. The Orient Express was already mythical, but Agatha Christie's story made it even more glamorous, more mysterious, and more legendary than it already was. The story took place on a new route for the service, one that opened in 1919 after a tunnel through the Alps connected Switzerland and Italy. This southern route took passengers through the beauty of Milan and Venice before heading into the Balkans. It was on this very route that the train earned its most famous, iconic look: the deep blue carriages with the name of the company, Compagnie Internationale de Wagenslits, written in gleaming gold letters. And so, as our own train moves through the darkness, a blue and gold ribbon carrying dreams across a continent, we are traveling inside a legend. A legend forged in iron, polished by artists, and made eternal by the mystery of a story. In 1939, as the Second World War began its destructive march across Europe, the Orient Express was forced to stop running for a second time. The luxurious blue and gold carriages were put into storage, their journeys suspended as the continent was once again plunged into darkness. When the war finally ended, the service resumed, but the world it returned to was a profoundly different place. The age of steam for trains was now over, replaced by cleaner, faster diesel and electric engines. But a new and far more powerful competitor had taken to the skies. While commercial airlines had existed before the war, they were often a terrible way to travel, noisy, unheated, and unable to fly at high altitudes. But in the 1950s and 60s, post-war innovations like the jet engine and pressurized cabins completely transformed air travel. Suddenly, a journey that took the Orient Express several days to complete could now be done in a matter of hours by plane. The romance of the rails began to collapse under the weight of the sheer speed and convenience of air travel. At the same time, another formidable barrier rose across the continent, one that was not made of mountains or rivers, but of politics and ideology. The Iron Curtain descended, dividing Europe into East and West. The historic route of the Orient Express now crossed through several of these new communist regimes, and their frontiers were far harder to cross. The glamour of a seamless journey was replaced by the tense reality of lengthy checks at heavily guarded borders, making the train slower than it had been before. The service itself began to deteriorate. The railway lines in some Eastern European countries like Romania and Bulgaria fell into disrepair. Unpredictable technical stops became more and more frequent, making it almost impossible for the train to respect its timetable. The legend, the myth, the aura of effortless luxury began to fade. The final journey of the historical Orient Express service took place in the 1970s. It wasn't a grand, dramatic end, but a quiet fading away. The name, Orient Express, did not disappear immediately, as it was used on other routes, but these new lines were no longer connected to the legendary service of the past. The company that had operated this rolling palace for almost a century had already diversified into hotels and travel agencies and was later bought out. What was gone, probably forever, was the very idea of these luxurious rolling hotels that George Pullman and George Nagelmakers had invented and popularized. In a world of jet planes and superhighways, there was simply no market anymore, no reason to be, for that kind of leisurely, opulent travel. The Orient Express, the Iron Queen of Europe, was gone for good. So let us look out the window of our compartment one last time. The elegant Art Deco lamps flicker and dim. The scent of fine perfume and expensive cigars fades from the air. The blue and gold carriages slow to a final, gentle stop. Our journey through the heart of Europe is over. But our travels tonight are not. Take a deep breath. For we are about to board another train, on another continent, for a journey into a land of immense scale and epic history. Our new train is not a rolling palace of Art Deco glamour. It is a powerful, practical, and resilient machine, built to conquer a continent. The windows of your compartment now look out upon a different world. Gone are the charming cities and rolling hills of France and Austria. In their place is an endless, hypnotic expanse of birch forests, sweeping grasslands, and a sky that seems bigger and emptier than any you have ever known. We are embarking on a journey along the Trans-Siberian Railway, a network of tracks that connects the great capital of Moscow with the Russian Far East, on the shores of the Pacific Ocean. To understand the miracle of this railway, you must first understand the immensity of the land it crosses. Before this iron ribbon was laid, the Russian Empire, which had grown so vast, was a fractured and disconnected place. To travel from the capital of St. Petersburg to the Pacific coast in the 19th century was an epic undertaking that took, quite literally, a month or more. There was only one road, the Great Siberian Route, but it was a treacherous and unreliable path. During the long, harsh winters, wheeled transport was impossible because of the deep snow, and travelers had to rely on horse-drawn sledges. In the summer, the route was cut by many wide and powerful rivers that flowed from south to north, making passage difficult and slow. For much of the 19th century, the idea of building a railway across this enormous, scarcely populated wilderness seemed like a fantasy. Russia was only just beginning its industrial revolution, and there were more pressing matters in the densely populated western part of the country. But the Tsarist government in St. Petersburg was worried. The Russian Far East, on the Pacific, was so disconnected that it was often easier for it to trade with China or Korea than with its own capital. The government feared this vast territory would become economically, and perhaps even politically, detached from the empire. And so, in the 1880s, after years of debate, the Russian government began to seriously consider the construction of a line that would finally connect the two sides of the empire, help develop the vast resources of Siberia, and reduce travel time from a matter of months to a matter of days. After 10 years of careful study and planning, construction finally began in 1891. It was one of the most ambitious engineering projects in human history. The line was divided into 7 huge sections, and work proceeded on all of them simultaneously. An army of more than 60,000 men was assembled to battle the harsh Siberian landscape. They faced immense challenges. While much of southern Siberia is relatively flat, there were still formidable obstacles to overcome. The most formidable of all was Lake Baikal. This was not a lake, it was an inland ocean, a body of water 400 miles wide and, in places, over a mile deep. Building a bridge was simply not an option. So, in a stroke of genius, the engineers built special, powerful ice-breaking ferries. These ferries were designed to connect the rail heads on either side of the lake, and they were so large that they could carry the entire train, locomotive and all, across the water. Imagine the sight of it, a whole train sailing across a vast, deep lake. It was a temporary solution, and in 1904, a new section of track was finally completed, winding its way through the mountains to the north of the Great Lake. Finally, in 1916, just 1 year before the Russian Revolution would change the country forever, the Great Trans-Siberian Railway was complete. For the first time, it was possible to travel without interruption from Moscow all the way to the port of Vladivostok on the Pacific. A journey of months was now a journey of mere days. The iron ribbon had been tied, and the vast, sleeping land of Siberia was finally, truly, connected to the heart of Russia. And it is on this very ribbon of steel that our journey into the vastness continues. Before there was Russia, before there was even the Tsardom of Moscow, these vast lands were populated by a people known as the Slavs. They are an Indo-European people, and their story begins in the mists of antiquity, in the great, sprawling lands of Eurasia. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, beginning in the 6th century AD, the Slavic tribes began a great migration, spreading out to settle most of Eastern and Central Europe, as well as the Balkans. They were a numerous and resilient people, and in many of the regions where they settled, their culture became dominant, as they assimilated the local populations. As they spread, they came into contact with the great civilizations of the medieval world, especially the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as Byzantium. And through this contact, they gradually converted to Christianity. While some in the West became Roman Catholic, the vast majority of Slavic peoples embraced the Orthodox faith of the Eastern Christian Rite. Over time, they formed the core populations of many of the great medieval states of Europe, Bulgaria, Croatia, and Serbia in the south, Poland and Bohemia in the west, and in the vast lands of the east, they formed a great federation called the Kievan Rus. This federation was first united in the 9th and 10th centuries by a powerful dynasty known as the Rurik, who originated in the northern city of Novgorod. Through war and diplomacy, this dynasty united the scattered East Slavic lands and moved their capital to the city of Kiev, in modern-day Ukraine, giving the federation its name. The Kievan Rus was a prosperous state that, at its peak in the 11th century, developed a rich and vibrant culture of its own. It was incredibly important, as it created a sense of Slavic unity in the far east of Europe, and it stands today as the shared cultural ancestor of the modern nations of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. A pivotal moment in their history came in the 10th century, when their king, Vladimir the Great, converted to Orthodox Christianity. He then extended this conversion by decree to all of his subjects. In practice, it would take several more centuries to convert all the peoples of the Rus, but this decision forever tied the destiny of this land to the Eastern Christian world. But this golden age was not to last. The decline of the Kievan Rus began at the end of the 11th century, and during the 12th century, the once mighty federation began to disintegrate into multiple, smaller, rival principalities. What remained of their unity was weakened even further by the decline of their great spiritual and trading partner, the Byzantine Empire. And then, in the 13th century, a great storm came from the east. The Mongol invasion swept across the lands, and what little remained of the Kievan Rus finally fell. The great federation was gone, but its legacy endured. From its ashes, new and independent Slavic states began to rise. Among them were the proud Novgorod Republic in the north, and a collection of smaller duchies in the east. One of these was a small, landlocked, and seemingly insignificant state, the Duchy of Moscow. It would have taken a great deal of imagination back then to see this small duchy one day becoming the largest country in the world. In the 14th century, among the fragmented East Slavic principalities, the Grand Duchy of Moscow began to emerge as the most powerful. Like many of its rivals, it was ruled by a descendant of the ancient Rurik dynasty. For a long time, its greatest rival was the proud and prosperous Novgorod Republic to the north. Novgorod was not a duchy ruled by a prince, but a powerful center of trade, a key member of the Hanseatic League, a medieval confederation of merchant guilds and cities that dominated trade around the Baltic Sea. Its possessions stretched from the Gulf of Finland all the way to the northern Ural Mountains, and it grew wealthy trading furs, salt, and timber for all the products of Western Europe. But the Grand Duchy of Moscow had a different ambition. It sought not just to trade, but to unify the East Slavic peoples and to finally repel the remnants of the Mongol Empire. This led to a series of wars between Moscow and Novgorod. Progressively, the Duchy of Moscow seized more and more of Novgorod's territory, until the great merchant city itself finally fell, and the republic was dissolved in the year 1478. One of the most important sovereigns of Moscow in this period was Ivan III, also known as Ivan the Great. On top of conquering Novgorod and absorbing his smaller rivals, he took the grand title of Grand Duke of all the Russias. His reign coincided with a world-changing event. In 1453, the great city of Constantinople, the heart of the Eastern Orthodox faith, fell to the Ottoman Turks. This event sent shockwaves throughout the Orthodox world. Ivan III seized this historic opportunity. He married a niece of the last Byzantine emperor and, in a powerful symbolic move, he adopted the Byzantine emblem of the double-headed eagle as his own. Moscow now claimed to be the successor of the Byzantine Empire, the Third Rome. The First Rome had fallen, the Second Rome, Constantinople, had fallen, and now Moscow would carry the torch of the Orthodox faith. This claim, both religious and political, would justify the ambitions of Moscow's rulers for centuries to come. A major successor to Ivan the Great was Ivan IV, who had a long and formidable reign in the 16th century, and who is known to history as Ivan the Terrible. He inherited an already large territory, but through ruthless and relentless conquest, he doubled it in size. He conquered the smaller states, or khanates, that had broken off from the disintegrating Golden Horde, such as Kazan and Astrakhan along the Volga River. He then conquered the Siberian Khanate to the east, a victory that opened the gates of Siberia to the Russians for the first time. As a result of this immense expansion and his unrivaled domination, Ivan IV was crowned as the first Tsar of Russia in the year 1547. The title Tsar comes from the word Caesar, another direct reference to the legacy of ancient Rome. With his coronation, the Grand Duchy of Moscow officially became the Tsardom of Russia. And from this point on, the name Russia would replace the older names of its predecessors. The Russia we know was born. With these conquests, especially the opening of Siberia, immensity became a core part of the country's identity. This vastness brought with it a constant struggle, the struggle to populate and unify such a gigantic area, to control its distant corners, and to rule over its many different ethnic groups and traditions. It is a struggle that would define Russia for the rest of its history. The 16th century ended, and the early 17th century did not begin well for Russia. When the sons of Ivan the Terrible died without heirs, the ancient Rurik dynasty died with them. A terrible famine began in 1601, leading to a period of civil war and foreign invasion known as the Time of Troubles. The Union of Poland-Lithuania, Russia's great rival to the west, occupied parts of the country and even seized the city of Moscow for a short time. It seemed as though the young Russian state might be torn apart before it truly had a chance to grow. But after more than a decade of chaos, a Russian volunteer corps forced the invaders to retreat, and an assembly of nobles agreed on a new ruler. In 1613, a new dynasty ascended to the throne, the Romanovs. Under the Romanovs, the country began a period of gradual recovery and renewed expansion. However, by the end of the 17th century, Russia was a strange paradox. It was larger than ever, a true giant, but it was a giant surrounded by enemies. And when it came to technology, education, and knowledge, Russia was still fairly backwards compared with Western Europe. Its society was still largely based on serfdom, a system that had mostly disappeared elsewhere in Europe. The country had almost no knowledge of navigation, very few universities, and was mostly closed off from the intellectual exchange that was flourishing in the West. Diplomatically, Russia was isolated. To the west, its access to the Baltic Sea was completely blocked by the powerful Swedish Empire. All of this was about to change with the arrival of a new Tsar, perhaps the most important and transformative ruler in all of Russia's history, Peter I, or Peter the Great. He was a man of boundless, almost terrifying, energy, and he had a vision. He spent his long reign of 43 years, at the turn of the 18th century, fighting two great wars, one against the Kingdom of Sweden to regain an access to the sea, and another against the traditions of his own country, to force it into the modern world. Peter traveled to Western Europe and saw for himself the shipyards, the factories, the universities, and the powerful courts of his rivals. He understood that for Russia to survive and play a role in this new world, it needed to catch up, to open itself to the outside, and to westernize. He faced enormous resistance at home. The powerful aristocracy, whose wealth was based on serfdom, and the deeply conservative Orthodox Church were hostile to his reforms. So Peter, using his absolute autocratic powers, had to impose his vision on his own subjects. His reforms were sweeping and dramatic. He created a Russian navy from scratch, he extended education and invited foreign scientists and technicians to Russia, and he forced the nobility to follow Western fashion, famously demanding that they shave their long, traditional beards. But his greatest ambition was to found a new capital, a great city on the shores of the Baltic Sea that would be his window to the west. Before he could do that, however, he needed to expel the Swedes. From 1700 to 1721, a major conflict known as the Great Northern War raged, opposing Sweden against a coalition led by Peter's Russia. The war was long and difficult, but in the end, it was a triumph for Peter. The ambitions of the Swedish Empire were ended, and Russia became the new dominant nation in the Baltic. On the lands he had conquered, Peter founded his new capital, St. Petersburg, a city built in the grand European style, which would serve as the capital of Russia for the next 2 centuries. In 1721, Peter the Great proclaimed the founding of the Russian Empire, and he became the first emperor of all Russia. In a single reign, he had transformed his country from a closed, isolated, and backwards tsardom into a major European power. His reforms, however, remained somewhat superficial. He had created a westernized elite and a powerful, modern army, but the majority of the population, the millions of peasants and serfs, were still living much as they had before. This created a deep and lasting gap between the country's rulers and its people, a gap that would define the next 2 centuries of Russian history. The 18th century confirmed Russia's new status as a major European power. Peter the Great was succeeded by several powerful empresses, the most famous of whom was Catherine the Great, who reigned from 1762 to 1796. Under Catherine, the empire continued its relentless expansion. After wars against the Ottomans, Russia finally annexed the Crimean Khanate, gaining a vital access to the warm waters of the Black Sea. To the west, Catherine participated with Prussia and Austria in the partitioning of the once mighty Poland-Lithuania, incorporating vast new territories into her empire. Russia's population was also booming, growing from 14 million people at the time of Peter's death to 170 million just before the First World War. The Russian giant was bigger and more powerful than ever. But its greatest test, and its greatest triumph, would come at the beginning of the 19th century, with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte in France. In the 1800s, Russia found itself involved in the Napoleonic Wars. At first, the results were disastrous. In 1805, Russia joined a coalition with Great Britain and Austria, but their combined forces were crushed by Napoleon's brilliant tactics at the Battle of Austerlitz. A few years later, Russia was defeated again at the Battle of Friedland. The Tsar was forced to switch sides and make an uneasy peace with France. But the alliance would not last. In 1812, Napoleon, displeased that Russia was not fully complying with his policies, made the worst miscalculation of his life. He launched a preemptive invasion of Russia. He assembled the largest invading force Europe had ever seen, the Grande Armée, and almost 700,000 soldiers marched into the vast Russian territory. The Russians, knowing they could not defeat this massive army in a single, decisive battle, employed a brilliant and brutal strategy. They retreated, deeper and deeper into the heart of their immense country. They avoided major battles and adopted a scorched earth policy, destroying any resources that the invading French army might have captured. Napoleon's army did eventually reach and capture Moscow, but it was a hollow victory. The city was deserted, and the Tsar still refused to sign a peace treaty. After waiting for a month for a surrender that never came, with the terrifying Russian winter fast approaching, Napoleon had no choice but to begin his retreat. What followed was one of the greatest disasters in military history. As the winter came, the Grand Army was destroyed, not by a great army, but by the cold, by hunger, and by the sheer, unforgiving size of Russia. As much as 95% of Napoleon's invading force was lost. This catastrophic retreat was the beginning of the end for Napoleon. Seeing their chance, all the countries of Europe rose up against him in a new coalition. 2 years later, in 1814, Russian armies triumphantly marched into Paris. In the reorganization of Europe that followed, Russia was one of the main victors, and the prestige of the Tsar reached a new high. But while the empire looked glorious on the outside, deep cracks were forming within. The liberal ideas of the French Revolution had spread across Europe, and they had reached Russia. While other countries were slowly liberalizing their political systems, Russia's autocratic regime had a hard time adapting. Some Tsars, like Alexander II, were willing to reform, but they faced immense resistance from a conservative society. The gap between the westernized elite and the vast majority of the population grew wider and wider. By the end of the 19th century, these internal tensions were getting worse. Russia was industrializing rapidly. The very Trans-Siberian line we are on is a product of this, but its society was increasingly filled with conflict. A humiliating defeat in the Crimean War in the 1850s, and an even more shocking defeat against Japan in 1905, dented the empire's prestige. The defeat against Japan triggered a major revolt in 1905, which forced the last Tsar, Nicholas II, to make concessions. But it was too little, too late. When the First World War began in 1914, Russia entered it in a state of profound internal weakness. The burden of the war and more defeats against the Germans would be the final blow, leading to the revolution in 1917 that would sweep the Tsar, the Romanov dynasty, and the entire Russian Empire away forever. Our journey begins anew in the year 1830, in the bustling port city of Baltimore. This is where and when the first railroad in the United States, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, was inaugurated. The America of 1830 was a country vastly different from the one we know today. It was a young nation of just 13 million inhabitants, still essentially rural and agrarian. Its people occupied only the eastern third of its current size. The vast lands to the west were a great, unknown frontier. But the air was thick with a sense of opportunity and a powerful belief in the nation's destiny to expand and build itself up. It was into this world of burgeoning ambition that the railroad arrived. The technology was at first copied from the British, but American ingenuity quickly took over. In late 1830, the first fully American-made locomotive was produced. It was called, with all the optimism of the age, the best friend of Charleston. And it was impressive, reaching speeds of 15 to 25 miles per hour, a breathtaking velocity in a world that had, until then, moved at the speed of a horse. This new invention was also a frightening novelty. The best friend of Charleston was also the first locomotive in America to suffer a boiler explosion. It seems the firemen, tired of listening to the constant hiss of the pressure release valve, decided to close it to stop the noise. The pressure built up until the boiler exploded. This accident eroded public confidence, and so, to restore it, early trains would often place a flat car packed with cotton bales between the locomotive and the passenger cars, to shield the passengers in case the engine met a similar fate. Despite these early fears, a railroad mania began to sweep the country. Throughout the 1830s and 40s, more and more lines were built, especially in the industrializing Northeast and the agrarian South. By the 1850s, there were over 9,000 miles of railroad lines in the United States. To stimulate even faster development, especially westward, the government began to offer huge land grants, gifting millions of acres to new railroad companies. But the greatest dream of all was to connect the two sides of the continent. Before the railroad, reaching California or Oregon from the East Coast was an incredibly long and dangerous journey. One could take a ship, but it was a ridiculously long voyage that had to go all the way down to the southern tip of South America and back up the other side. The alternative was by land, a grueling, months-long journey by horse and wagon across plains, deserts, and the Rocky Mountains. The appeal of a transcontinental railroad was obvious, but the scale of the project, requiring thousands of miles of track and a huge investment, was staggering. This was the project that would change the scale of the railroad industry forever. To build it, tens of thousands of Chinese and Irish workers were hired to lay the tracks across the unforgiving landscape. And finally, in 1869, the dream became a reality. The first transcontinental railroad was opened, connecting the existing eastern network with the Pacific coast. The time it took to travel from one side of the country to the other dropped from a matter of months to only 6 days. This was a crucial, nation-defining moment. With this iron ribbon stitching it together, the American territory was finally integrated into a single market and a single, unified nation. Soon, other transcontinental lines followed, one to the south and one to the north. Railroads had not just conquered a landscape, they had created a country. It is hard to overstate just how profoundly the railroads transformed the United States. Before them, the national economy was fragmented. A farmer in Ohio and a merchant in California might as well have lived in different countries. But with the opening of the transcontinental lines, that all changed. For the first time, a single, unified market was created. A factory in New York could now send its goods to the other side of the country in a matter of days. This boosted industrial growth on an unprecedented scale, leading to the rise of massive factories with thousands of workers, all built to satisfy this new, nationwide demand. The lives of ordinary Americans were also deeply impacted. For consumers, the variety of goods available increased dramatically. Mail-order companies like Sears and Roebuck could now send their big catalogs by mail to every corner of the country, and deliver their products to the nearest train station. A farmer in a small town in Kansas could now buy the same musical instrument or the latest piece of agricultural equipment as a resident of Chicago. For workers, the railroads offered new kinds of opportunities. They tended to pay better than other industries, and to retain their employees, they offered benefits, including some of the first pension schemes for blue-collar workers. A man could start as a fireman working on the tracks and, with hard work, rise up to become an engineer, changing his entire standard of living. But this new age of opportunity was also an age of immense and often brutal competition. The sheer amount of money needed to build and operate these vast railroad networks created a new kind of financial system based on stocks and bonds, with Wall Street at its center. And it created a new kind of businessmen, men of immense wealth and power who came to dominate not just the railroads, but entire industries. They were known as the robber barons. One of the most famous was Cornelius Vanderbilt. He made his initial fortune in shipping, but he understood early that railroads were the future of transportation. He invested heavily, eventually gaining control of the New York Central Railroad, which connected New York City with Chicago. Vanderbilt was a brilliant organizer, but he was also known for his brutal business methods. He and men like him were called robber barons for their exploitative practices, paying minimal wages, squashing competition by ruining and acquiring their rivals, and using their immense wealth to influence government. Another of these powerful figures was Jay Gould. He was a master of the stock market, known for taking huge risks and for his willingness to manipulate prices and use insider information. He was involved in a famous attempt to corner the gold market, and though it ultimately failed, he managed to escape prosecution thanks to his political connections. He became one of the most hated of all the robber barons. And yet, these men were also great builders. While their methods were often questionable, they were probably driven more by the thirst for power and the urge to build great companies than by pure greed. They often gave back a substantial part of their fortunes to charities, universities, and museums. Vanderbilt's fortune in the 1870s, adjusted for inflation, would amount to more than $200 billion today, comparable to the wealthiest people in our own time. But as these men grew richer and their railroad monopolies grew more powerful, opposition began to arise. Farmers, in particular, were often at the mercy of the railroads, which could impose incredibly high prices to transport their crops. The positive image of the railroads as a symbol of progress began to tarnish. They were also seen as symbols of unhinged capitalism and corporate greed. The Gilded Age was glittering on the surface, but underneath, the tensions in American society were beginning to grow. The American railroad network reached its peak in 1916, with more than 250,000 miles of tracks crisscrossing the continent. But by then, the Golden Age was already over. The magic of the first decades, when people would dress up on Sundays just to watch the trains arrive, was gone. The great railroad companies had become powerful, sometimes predatory, monopolies, and the public's enthusiasm had turned into a more complicated mixture of necessity and mistrust. The first sign of trouble came during the First World War. In 1917, it became clear that the network of separate, private operators was unable to adequately support the war effort, and the U.S. government had to temporarily nationalize the management of the railroads until 1920. But the greatest threat to the railroads was not political, it was technological. After the war, the automobile era truly began. A new kind of freedom was offered to Americans, the freedom of the open road. Cars and trucks were more flexible, able to go anywhere, anytime. The nation's priority shifted from building railways to paving highways. Then came the Great Depression of the 1930s, a devastating blow to the entire economy. Railroads nosedived. Many smaller lines failed and disappeared forever. The industry survived, but it never fully recovered its former glory. After World War II, a new competitor delivered the final blow to long-distance passenger travel, the airline industry. With modern jet engines, a journey across the continent that took days by train could now be completed in a matter of hours. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, most American railroads abandoned their passenger train services, which were no longer profitable. The grand cross-country trains, once symbols of American progress, were retired. For most Americans, the practice of traveling long distances by train became a thing of the past. But the story does not end there. While passenger traffic declined, freight activities remained competitive for carrying heavy loads on long-distance routes. The great iron arteries of the nation found a new purpose, becoming the quiet, powerful workhorses of the American economy. And to preserve a thread of passenger service, the U.S. government created a new company, Amtrak, which still operates long-distance lines today, though its share of the market is very small compared to airlines. And now, there are whispers of a new beginning. High-speed train systems are being built. One is already functioning in Florida, and there is a large project in California that aims to connect Los Angeles and San Francisco in under 3 hours. Perhaps a new golden age for the American passenger train is just over the horizon. But our journey for tonight has reached its end. We have traveled from the Orient Express in a Europe of empires to the Trans-Siberian in the vastness of Russia, and finally, across the American continent on the iron rails that built a nation. I hope you have enjoyed our trip around the world. For now, I will let you relax and fall asleep, if you wish to the sweet, rhythmic sounds of the train. Sleep well. Sweet dreams.